I killed your husband. He confessed to the woman who'd been bringing him soup every day since Christmas. The snow fell like judgment that Christmas Eve, each flake cold and quiet against Jack Morrison's weathered face. His horse moved slow through the drifts, breath coming out in white clouds that hung in the still air before fading into nothing. The weight in his chest felt heavier than the cold on his hip, heavier than the saddle beneath him, heavier than all the miles he'd ridden to get here. Cedar Falls was smaller than he'd imagined. Maybe 30 buildings scattered along a single dirt road, now buried under 6 inches of fresh powder. Yellow light leaked from a few windows, warm against the blue-white of evening snow. Somewhere behind those windows, families sat around tables, sharing Christmas supper. Children laughed. Mothers hummed lullabies. The world went on, same as it always did, while his own world had ended 3 months back on a dusty trail outside Tucson. He pulled his hat low and urged his mare forward. Her hooves made soft sounds in the snow, like whispers, like secrets, the kind he'd been carrying since September, when everything changed in the space of a heartbeat and a gunshot. The saloon sat dark at the far end of town. No music tonight, no drunken laughter spilling into the street. Even the roughest men found somewhere warm to be on Christmas Eve. Jack tied his horse to the rail and stood for a moment, looking back down the row of houses. Smoke rose from most of the chimneys, straight up in the windless air. He'd asked about her in 3 towns before this one. Sarah Henley, the woman whose husband wouldn't be coming home. The woman who still set 2 plates for dinner every night, still looked down the road each morning like maybe today would be different. The woman who'd been married to Thomas Henley for 8 years, who'd waited for him through cattle drives and bad winters and all the small dangers that came with loving a man in this hard country. Jack pulled his gloves tighter and started walking. The house sat on the north side of town, smaller than the others, but well kept. White paint that hadn't peeled too much. A fence around a little garden, now buried under snow, but probably pretty come spring. Light glowed warm in both front windows, and as Jack got closer, he could see movement inside. A woman's shadow against the curtains, moving back and forth like she was cooking. He stopped at the gate and just stood there, watching. The cold bit through his coat, but he didn't feel it much. All his feeling had gone numb 3 months back. All except for the weight in his chest, the stone of what he'd done, what he had to carry for the rest of his days. Through the window, he could see her clearly now. Small woman, dark hair pinned up neat. She stood at the stove, stirring something in a big pot. Soup, maybe. Her movements were careful, gentle. Every so often she'd taste what she was making, nod to herself, add a little salt or pepper. Taking care with it, like it mattered. Like someone special was coming to share it with her. Jack's hand moved to his gun without thinking, then fell away. Old habits. There'd be no shooting his way out of this one. No running, either. He'd tried that for 3 months, riding from town to town, trying to outrun what he'd done. But guilt had longer legs than any horse, and it had caught up to him in the end. The snow kept falling, covering his tracks, covering the whole world in clean, white silence. If only it could cover what was inside him, too. But some stains went too deep for snow. He'd been different once. Before the war, before he'd learned to live by his gun, before that September day when everything went wrong. His mother used to make soup like that, standing at their old stove in Kansas, humming while she worked. She died while he was off fighting, and he'd never got to taste her cooking again. Never got to sit at that kitchen table and tell her he was sorry for all the worry he'd caused her. Now here was another woman, making soup in another kitchen, and Jack Morrison was about to destroy her life the same way his had been destroyed. The same way Thomas Henley's had been destroyed in a canyon outside Tucson when Jack's gun spoke faster than his better judgment. Self-defense, he'd told himself at first. Thomas had drawn first, had been reaching for his weapon when Jack put 2 bullets in his chest. But that was a lie, and Jack knew it. Thomas Henley had been reaching for his water bottle, not his gun. Had been trying to offer a drink to the stranger who'd asked for directions. Had been trying to show kindness to a man who'd repaid it with death. The woman in the window moved to the cabinet, took down 2 bowls. 2 spoons. Set them careful on a small wooden table. She looked toward the door like she was expecting someone. Like maybe tonight would be the night her husband finally came home from that cattle drive, tired and dusty and full of stories about the trail. Jack pushed open the gate. It creaked once, then swung silent. His boots made no sound in the snow as he walked up the little path to her door. Each step felt like walking toward the edge of cliff. Each step brought him closer to the moment when he'd have to speak the words that would break this woman's heart. He stopped at the door and raised his hand to knock. Then let it fall. Raised it again. Let it fall. Behind the wood, he could hear her moving around, maybe setting the table nice. Maybe lighting a candle. Getting ready for Christmas Eve dinner with a man who would never come. The weight in his chest pressed harder. Thomas Henley had been carrying a letter when he died. Jack had found it in his saddlebags when he was going through the dead man's things to learn his name. A letter to Sarah, full of love and promises to be home by Christmas. Full of plans for the future they'd have together, the children they'd raise, the life they'd build in their little house with the white fence and the garden. All of it ended because Jack Morrison's trigger finger was too fast and his judgment too slow. He knocked. 3 soft raps that seemed to echo in the still air. Footsteps inside, quick and light. The door opened, and there she was. Smaller than she'd looked through the window, with kind eyes and work-worn hands. Pretty in a quiet way, the kind of pretty that grew on a man over years of looking. She smiled when she saw him, the sort of smile good people gave to strangers on cold nights. "Evening," she said. Her voice was soft, musical. "You look half frozen. Are you all right?" Jack opened his mouth to speak and found nothing there. No words, no breath, just the weight pressing down on him like the winter sky. She was so alive, so warm, so full of hope that maybe this stranger at her door had news of her husband. He started, then stopped. Tried again. "Ma'am, my name's Jack Morrison." She waited, patient as snow falling. Kind eyes searching his face. Behind her, the soup smell drifted out warm and rich. Behind her, the table set for 2. Behind her, a life about to change forever. "I knew your husband," Jack said finally, the words coming out rough and broken. "Thomas Henley. I knew him." Her whole face lit up like sunrise. Hope bloomed in her eyes, bright and painful to see. She stepped forward, reaching out like she might touch his arm. "Oh," she breathed. "Oh, you have news of him. Please come in from the cold. Come in and tell me." But Jack couldn't move, couldn't step across that threshold into her warm kitchen, into her life that still made sense. Couldn't sit at her table and let her serve him soup while the truth sat in his chest like a stone. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow he'd find the words. Tomorrow he'd be strong enough to break her heart and his own. Tonight, he'd just stand here in the snow and let her hope live a little longer in the warm light of her window. January came cold and stayed that way. Every morning, Jack Morrison woke in the little room above the general store and told himself today would be different. Today he'd walk to Sarah Henley's door and speak the words that needed speaking. Today he'd stop being a coward. But every morning, when he knocked on her door, the words died in his throat. "Mr. Morrison," she'd say, opening the door with flour on her hands or snow melting in her dark hair. Right on time for breakfast. Like he was expected. Like he belonged at her table instead of 6 feet under the ground where men like him should be. She never asked why he came. Never questioned why a stranger would show up at her door every day just as the sun touched the eastern hills. She just let him in, same as she had that first Christmas morning when he'd stood on her porch shivering, not from cold but from the weight of what he couldn't say. The kitchen was always warm, always smelled like bread baking or soup simmering. She moved through it like a dancer, reaching for this bowl or that spoon without looking, knowing where everything lived. Her hands were small but strong, weathered from work but gentle when she set a steaming bowl in front of him. Thomas always said the secret to good soup was patience, she'd tell him, settling into the chair across from his. The chair where her husband should have been sitting. Let it cook slow. Let all the flavors get to know each other. Jack would nod and lift the spoon to his mouth, and every bite tasted like dust. Like guilt. Like all the things he should have said but didn't. The soup was probably good, Sarah Henley seemed like the kind of woman who'd been making perfect soup since she was old enough to reach the stove. But everything tasted like ash to him now. He's been gone longer than usual this time, she'd continue, stirring her own bowl without really eating. But spring drives can be tricky. Weather turns fast. Rivers run high from snowmelt. She'd pause, look toward the window like maybe she'd see him coming up the road. He'll be home soon, though. Thomas always comes home. The words hit Jack like bullets every time. Worse than bullets. Bullets just killed the body. These words killed something deeper, something that had been trying to heal itself before he'd come to this town and started ripping it open again every morning. He tried staying away once. Woke up on a Tuesday in early February and decided enough was enough. Packed his saddlebags, paid his bill at the store, saddled his mare. He was 3 miles out of town when he turned around. Couldn't explain why, even to himself. Maybe it was the thought of Sarah setting 2 bowls on the table and having no one show up to fill the second chair. Maybe it was knowing she'd worry about another man who'd disappeared from her life without explanation. Or maybe it was just that running away hadn't worked yet, and he was too tired to try again. When he knocked on her door that afternoon, she opened it with worried eyes. "I thought maybe you'd moved on," she said. Relief in her voice, like his presence mattered to her, like she'd miss him if he left. That hurt worst of all. "No, ma'am," he said. "Not moving on just yet." She smiled then, bright as sunshine after rain. "Good. I made extra soup today. Hope you'll be back for supper." February melted into March, and still he came. Still she fed him. Still the words sat like stones in his chest, getting heavier every day. She told him stories about Thomas while they ate. How they'd met at a church social when she was 17. How he'd been too shy to ask her to dance until the very last song. How he'd proposed by carving their initials in the old oak tree behind her father's house. How they'd built this little house together, board by board, dream by dream. "We always planned to have children," she said one afternoon, staring into her soup bowl. "Thomas loves children. Says he wants a whole house full of them running around, making noise, getting underfoot." She looked up at Jack with sad eyes. "I suppose we waited too long. Now I wonder if we'll get the chance." Jack's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. The weight in his chest pressed harder, made it hard to breathe. All those plans, all those dreams, ended because his gun was faster than his brain. Because he'd seen a man reach for something and assumed the worst. Because he'd learned to kill first and ask questions later, and unlearning that lesson had cost an innocent man his life. "Ma'am," he started, then stopped. The words were there, right behind his teeth. "I killed your husband 3 months ago, outside Tucson. It was my fault. I'm sorry." But they wouldn't come, stuck in his throat like thorns. Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand. Her fingers were warm, gentle, real. "You don't talk much about yourself, Mr. Morrison," she said. "Are you married? Do you have family somewhere?" "No, ma'am." The words came out rough. "No family. No wife. Nobody waiting for me anywhere." She squeezed his hand once, then let go. "That must be lonely." Lonely. Yes, that was part of it. But it was more than lonely. It was empty. Hollow. Like he'd died that day outside Tucson too. But his body had forgotten to fall down. "Your husband," Jack said suddenly, surprising himself. What kind of man was he? Sarah's whole face softened. Love there, deep and real and lasting. "Kind," she said without hesitation. "Thomas was the kindest man I ever knew. Always helped neighbors with their harvest, even when our own needed tending. Always had a smile for children, a coin for beggars. He once spent his whole winter coat money buying medicine for old Mrs. Garcia when she took sick." She paused, lost in memory. "Some men get hard living out here. The land breaks them, or they break themselves trying to master it. But Thomas stayed gentle, said the world had enough hardness in it without him adding more." Each word was a knife in Jack's gut. A kind man, a gentle man, a man who'd probably never drawn his gun in anger, never shot anyone over a misunderstanding, never left a widow sitting alone at a kitchen table waiting for someone who'd never come home. The silence stretched between them after that, heavy and full. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Inside, the fire crackled in the stove. Sarah's spoon clinked against her bowl. Normal sounds a normal life, but nothing felt normal anymore. Jack looked at her across the small table. This woman who'd been nothing but kind to him, who'd fed him and welcomed him and worried about him when he disappeared for a day. This woman whose life he'd destroyed with 2 quick shots in a dusty canyon. This woman who deserved so much better than lies and silence, and a coward who couldn't find the strength to tell her the truth. He opened his mouth to speak, to finally say the words that needed saying. But instead, what came out was, "The soup's real good, ma'am." "Thank you." Sarah smiled, sad and sweet and trusting, and Jack Morrison felt his heart break a little more. Tomorrow, he promised himself, tomorrow he'd be brave enough to shatter her world and face whatever came after. The snow began to melt in early April, turning the streets of Cedar Falls into rivers of mud and broken ice. Water dripped from every roof, every fence post, every bare branch, reaching toward a sun that finally had some warmth to it. The sound was everywhere, dripping, running, flowing, like the world was crying for winter's end. Jack Morrison stood at his window above the general store, watching Sarah Henley work in her garden. She'd been out there since dawn, pulling away dead stalks from last year, turning the black earth with her hands. Even from his distance, he could see the worry in the set of her shoulders, the way she kept looking up the road like maybe today would be different. 6 months, now, since Thomas Henley should have returned from his cattle drive. 6 months of Sarah setting 2 plates at every meal. 6 months of Jack sitting at her table, choking down soup that tasted like guilt and listening to her talk about her husband like he might walk through the door any minute. The lies were eating him alive. He pulled on his coat and boots and went downstairs. The store owner, old Mr. Patterson, looked up from his ledger with knowing eyes. "Going to see the widow again?" Patterson asked. It wasn't really a question. The whole town knew Jack's routine by now. Breakfast at Sarah's table. Lunch at Sarah's table. Sometimes supper too if she asked. Always the same chair, always the same silence, always the same weight pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe. "Yes, sir," Jack said. Patterson nodded, went back to his numbers. But before Jack could reach the door, the old man spoke again. "She's been asking questions around town. About cattle drives that might have run late. About where her husband might have wintered." A pause. "She's starting to worry something's wrong." Jack's hand stilled on the door handle. He'd seen the worry growing in Sarah's eyes, heard it in the way her voice caught sometimes when she talked about Thomas. Seen how she'd started watching the horizon with desperate intensity, like she could will her husband home through pure wanting. "I know," Jack said quietly. "Man can't run from the truth forever," Patterson said, not looking up from his ledger. "Truth has a way of catching up, whether we're ready or not." Outside, the morning air smelled like wet earth and new grass. Spring coming whether anyone wanted it or not. Jack walked through the muddy streets towards Sarah's house, his boots making sucking sounds in the soft ground. Each step felt heavier than the last. He found her kneeling in her garden, hands dark with soil. She'd planted something. He could see tiny green shoots poking up through the earth in neat rows. Onions, maybe, or carrots. Things that would grow slow and steady through the summer. Things she planned to harvest come fall. Things Thomas would never see. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," she said without looking up. Her voice was different today, strained, like she'd been crying, though her eyes were dry when she finally turned to face him. "Morning, ma'am." She sat back on her heels, wiping her hands on her apron. "I planted the garden early this year. Thomas always said to wait until after the last frost, but—" She trailed off, looking at the small green shoots with fierce protectiveness. "I needed something to hope for." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. Hope. That's what he'd been stealing from her all these months. Not just her husband, but her hope too. Every day, he sat at her table and let her believe Thomas might come home. He was killing her a little more. "Sarah," he said, her name rough in his throat. She looked up at him, surprised. He'd never used her first name before. Always ma'am, or Mrs. Henley. Always keeping that distance, that pretense that they were just strangers sharing meals. "I need to tell you something," he continued. His heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. "About your husband." The hope that flared in her eyes was like looking directly at the sun, bright and painful and impossible to face. "You have news." She scrambled to her feet, dirt falling from her dress. "Did you see him? Did someone tell you where he is?" "Sarah." Jack stepped closer, his hands shaking. Around them, the garden seemed to hold its breath. The birds stopped singing. Even the wind went still. "Sarah, I need you to sit down." "No." The word came out sharp, afraid. She took a step backward, shaking her head. "No, I don't want to sit down. Just tell me. Where's he? Where's Thomas?" Jack looked at her standing there in her garden, surrounded by the green shoots of things she'd planted in hope, her face full of desperate love and growing fear. This woman who'd fed him for months, who'd worried about him when he disappeared, who'd shown him more kindness than he deserved. This woman whose life he was about to destroy with 4 simple words. "He's dead," Jack said quietly. "Thomas is dead." The color drained from Sarah's face like water from a broken cup. She swayed on her feet, one hand reaching out blindly for support that wasn't there. Jack stepped forward to catch her, but she pulled back, shaking her head. "No," she whispered. "No, you're wrong. He's just late. He's done this before, been late coming home. He'll be here soon. He promised he'd be here by Christmas, and Thomas keeps his promises." "Sarah, how do you know?" The words came out harsh, desperate. "How could you possibly know? You said you knew him, but how? When? Where did you meet my husband?" This was it, the moment he'd been dreading for 6 months. The moment when he'd have to speak the words that would change everything forever. Jack took a deep breath, tasted mud and new grass, and the salt of tears he didn't know he was crying. "Because I killed him." The silence that followed was absolute. Like the world had stopped turning, stopped breathing, stopped being. Sarah stood frozen in her garden, her mouth open, her eyes wide with shock, so complete it looked like death itself. A bird started singing somewhere, then stopped abruptly, as if it too understood that something terrible had just happened. "What?" The word came out, barely a whisper. "September 23rd. Jack continued, his voice steady now that the worst was finally out. "Outside Tucson. It was an accident, but that doesn't matter. I put 2 bullets in his chest. I killed your husband, and then I came here and let you feed me soup for 6 months while you waited for a man who's never coming home." Sarah made a sound then, not quite a scream, not quite a sob. Something deeper and more broken than either. She doubled over like she'd been punched, her arms wrapped around her middle, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Jack wanted to go to her, to catch her before she fell, but he stayed where he was. He'd forfeited the right to comfort her the day he'd pulled that trigger. "Why?" she gasped, still bent over, still fighting for breath. "Why would you? How could you?" He was reaching for something. "I thought it was a gun. I thought he was going to shoot me." The words felt like ash in his mouth. It was his water bottle. He was trying to offer me a drink. Sarah straightened slowly, and when she looked at him, Jack saw something die in her eyes. The trust that had been there every morning when she'd opened her door to him. The kindness she'd shown to a stranger. The gentle hope that had kept her going through the long winter months. All of it gone. Murdered as surely as her husband had been. "Get out," she said, her voice hollow and strange. "Sarah, get out." The scream tore from her throat with such force that it sent the birds exploding from the nearby trees. "Get out of my garden. Get out of my house. Get away from me." Jack turned and walked away, his boots squelching in the mud. Behind him, he could hear Sarah falling to her knees in her garden, her sobs mixing with the sound of spring rain that had started to fall, washing the world clean while leaving the deepest stains untouched. Jack Morrison packed his saddlebags that same afternoon, his hands steady for the first time in months. The weight in his chest hadn't lifted, might never lift, but it felt different now. Cleaner, somehow, like a wound that had finally been opened to the air. He was cinching the straps on his bedroll when a knock came at his door. Soft, hesitant. When he opened it, Sarah Henley stood in the hallway, her face pale as winter snow, her eyes red from crying. "Don't go," she said simply. Jack stared at her. After what he'd told her, after the way she'd screamed at him to leave, he'd expected never to see her again. Had planned on riding out at first light and never looking back. "Ma'am," I think it's best if I don't call me ma'am." Her voice was quiet but firm. "My name is Sarah. And don't go. Not yet." She stepped past him into the small room, looking at his packed belongings scattered across the bed. Her presence filled the space in a way that made the air feel thin. "What?" Jack asked. Sarah was quiet for a long time, staring at his saddlebags like they might give her answers. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Because if you leave now, he's just gone. Just nothing. But if you stay—" She looked up at him, and he saw something desperate and broken and strangely hopeful in her eyes. "If you stay, maybe there's a reason. Maybe his death meant something." Jack didn't understand, but he unpacked his bags. The days that followed were the strangest of his life. Sarah didn't speak to him, wouldn't even look at him directly. But every morning when he knocked on her door, she let him in, set one bowl on the table instead of two, serve him soup that tasted like nothing at all. They ate in silence that felt different from before. Not the comfortable quiet of shared meals, but something heavier, like the air before a storm that might never break. A week passed this way. Then, too, Jack began to think this was his punishment, to sit at her table every day and feel the weight of what he'd stolen from her. To see the empty chair where Thomas should have been sitting, to watch Sarah move through her kitchen like a ghost of herself. But slowly, things began to change. It started when her fence blew down in a spring storm. Jack was walking past her house. He'd taken to walking the streets at night when sleep wouldn't come, and saw the broken rails scattered across her garden. The young plants she'd worked so hard to nurture were exposed to the wind and rain, defenseless. He didn't think about it, just found a hammer in her shed and started working. The wood was old but solid. Thomas had built it well, built it to last. By morning, Jack had it standing again, stronger than before. When Sarah found him nailing the last board into place, she stopped at the gate and watched him work. Didn't say anything, just watched. When he finished and turned to go, she spoke for the first time in 2 weeks. "Thank you." The next morning when he knocked, she let him in as always. But this time, she handed him a cup of coffee along with his bowl. "The fence looks good," she said. "Thomas always meant to fix that loose post on the east side. You did it right." Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. Spring turned to summer, and a routine developed between them. Sarah would find work that needed doing, a leaky roof, a stuck door, weeds choking her vegetable garden. Jack would do the work without being asked, using his hands to say what his words couldn't. That he was sorry, that he wished things had been different, that he would spend the rest of his life trying to build back even a small part of what he destroyed. The garden grew. Sarah's onions came up strong and straight. Her carrots pushed green tops through the black soil. Her beans climbed the stakes Thomas had made years before, reaching toward the sun like prayers. Jack found himself thinking about those stakes as he worked. How Thomas had cut them, shaped them, driven them into the earth. How he'd planned for growth, for harvest, for years of gardens yet to come. How his hands had touched the same wood Jack was touching now. It should have felt like haunting, but somehow it didn't. It felt like conversation. One evening in July, as Jack was fixing a loose hinge on her gate, Sarah brought him a glass of water. She sat on the fence post and stood watching him work the way she had that first day. "He would have liked you," she said suddenly. Jack's hand stilled on the screwdriver. "Mom." "Sarah," she corrected, gentle but firm. "And Thomas would have liked you. He always said you could tell a man's character by how he treated other people's things. How careful he was with what didn't belong to him." Jack looked up at her, this woman whose husband he'd killed, whose life he'd shattered, who was somehow standing here talking about kindness while he fixed her gate. "I don't understand you," he said honestly. Sarah smiled, sad and small but real. "I don't understand me, either." She went back inside, but the next morning when Jack came for breakfast, there were 2 bowls on the table again. They began to talk. Not about Thomas, not about that day outside Tucson, but about small things. The weather, the garden, whether the beans would be ready by August. Sarah told him about her childhood, about learning to cook from her grandmother, about the first time she tried to make bread and burned it so bad they'd had to air out the house for days. Jack found himself talking too, sharing stories he hadn't told in years. About his mother's garden in Kansas. about the war and what it had taught him about fear and courage and the thin line between them. About the years after, when he'd forgotten how to be anything but dangerous. "What will you do?" Sarah asked one evening as they sat on her porch watching the sunset paint the sky red and gold. "When winter comes, I mean. Will you stay?" Jack was quiet for a long time. He'd been asking himself the same question for weeks now. Part of him wanted to leave, to spare her the daily reminder of what he'd done. But another part of him, the part that was learning to hope again, wanted to stay. To keep working with his hands, to keep building instead of destroying. "If you'll have me," he said finally. Sarah nodded, looking out at her garden where the beans hung heavy on their stakes, ready for harvest. "There's a lot of work to do before the snow comes," she said. "Vegetables to put up, wood to split. The shed roof needs patching." "I can do that," Jack said. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out one by one. Not the desperate quiet of winter, but something peaceful, something that felt like possibility. Jack Morrison would never be forgiven. He knew that now. Some things were too big for forgiveness, too broken to be made whole. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe redemption wasn't about being absolved. Maybe it was about learning to carry the weight of what you'd done and still finding ways to build something good from the ashes. Sarah would never stop missing Thomas. Would never stop grieving the life they'd planned together, the children they'd never have, the years stolen from them. But she was learning, too, that sorrow didn't have to mean the end of everything. That even salted earth could grow something new if you were patient enough, gentle enough, determined enough to keep trying. In her garden, the plants Thomas had never seen reached toward the harvest moon, heavy with the promise of food for the winter ahead. Tomorrow there would be work to do. Beans to pick, tomatoes to can, preparations for the cold months coming. But tonight, two broken people sat on a small porch in a small town, sharing the kind of peace that can only grow from the deepest understanding of loss. They had planted seeds in salted earth and somehow, impossibly, watched them grow.